The air in Arlen Vance's new showroom in the spring of '72 was thick with the smell of fresh paint, armor-all, and something else. Arrogance. It was a clean, sterile smell, a world away from the honest funk of diesel, hydraulic fluid, and rich soil that clung to my clothes. I stood there on his polished concrete floor, a small, greasy hydraulic fitting clutched in my hand, feeling like a ghost from a bygone era. "Jedediah, I'm telling you, you're trying to put a $10 patch on a $100 problem," Arlen said, his voice smooth as the chrome on the new Cadillac Eldorado parked out front. He gestured with a soft, uncalloused hand toward the centerpiece of his showroom, a magnificent John Deere 4x30, its green paint so deep you could drown in it. The sound guard cab sat on top like a command module, a space-age bubble of air conditioning and AM/FM radio. This is the future. You're out there wrestling with that old 4020, deafening yourself on an open station, while men half your age are farming twice your acres in half the time. In comfort, Jed. In comfort. I turned the worn fitting over in my palm. It was a specific elbow connector for the remote hydraulic line on my 40C20, the one that ran the cylinder on the disc. A simple piece of steel, but essential. "The 4020 runs fine, Arlen. Just needs this one piece. The threads are stripped." Arlen laughed, a short, dismissive bark. He was a dealer, but he hadn't spent a day on a tractor since his daddy made him rake hay as a boy. He sold financing as much as he sold iron. "Runs fine? Jed, that tractor came off the line in '68. That's 4 years old. The warranty's a distant memory. The hours you've got on that diesel, it's a ticking time bomb. I can get you in this 4430. 0 down for a man with your credit, and payments you won't even feel with corn heading for $2 a bushel." I looked from the fitting in my hand to the monolithic tractor in the showroom. The 4430 was a beast, no doubt. 125 horsepower at the PTO, a quad-range transmission you could shift on the fly, power steering so light a child could turn it. My 48020 was rated at 95 horses, and its synchro-range transmission demanded a firm hand and a full stop to change ranges. It was a good, honest machine, a tractor my father and I had picked out together before he passed. We'd paid for it in cash, a fact that seemed to offend Arlen on a deeply personal level. "The bank owns the future, Jed," he continued, leaning against the massive rear tire of the new tractor. "Leverage. That's the word. The government wants us to feed the world. Prices are going up. Land values are going up. You use the bank's money to buy a machine like this. You farm more land. You make more money. You pay the bank, and you pocket the difference. It's simple. The men who understand that are buying their second and third farms. The men who don't." He let his gaze drift to the greasy fitting in my hand. The implication was clear. I knew the numbers. I read the farm journal. I saw the prices at the co-op. Things were good. Maybe the best they'd ever been. My neighbors were all trading up. Bill Jensen just bought a new 1466 from the international dealer, a red monster with a turbo that screamed like a banshee. The Peterson boys had a whole fleet of new green paint. Their farms looked like dealership lots come planting season, and all of it, every last piece, was bought on credit. Notes held by men like Arlen, or the PCA, or the bank in town. My father always said, "If you can't pay cash for it, you can't afford it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "That 4020 is mine. The land it works is mine. The roof over my head is mine. When I sell a bushel of corn, the money comes to my pocket, not to a banker's." Arlen shook his head, a look of genuine pity on his face. Your father was a good man, Jed, but he farmed in a different world. This is 1972. We're going to the moon. You're still farming like it's 1952. That thinking, it'll bury you. You'll be a peasant on your own land, watching your neighbors fly to Florida in the winter while you're patching cracked manifolds with furnace cement. He made it sound so simple, so foolproof, a shining path into a future of endless growth and easy money, paved with bank loans and brand new iron. All you had to do was sign on the dotted line. But my gut, the same gut that told me when a storm was coming or when a bearing was about to go, screamed that it was a trap. It felt like a gilded cage, and the monthly payment was the key that locked the door from the outside. Before we go any further in this story, before I tell you what I did and what happened over the next 8 years, I have to ask you folks listening. Have you ever met a man so sure of the future he completely forgot the hard-earned lessons of the past? Let me know down in the comments, because I was looking at one standing right there on that polished floor, smelling of cheap cologne and easy credit. "I'll just take the fitting, Arlen," I said, laying it on the parts counter. "If you can find one." His parts man, a lanky kid named Tim, scurried to the back, clanking through metal bins. Arlen sighed, the picture of a prophet whose wisdom was being ignored. "Suit yourself, Jed, but don't come crying to me when that old relic leaves you stranded in the middle of spring planting and your neighbors are all finished and heading to the lake." He found the part, a genuine John Deere fitting, still in its little green and yellow box. It cost me $4.65. I paid for it with a worn $5 bill from my wallet and walked out, the jingle of the bell on the door sounding like a final warning. I didn't look back at the 40 or 30. I didn't need to. I had its image burned into my mind, a symbol of a world that was moving on, a world that was telling me I was a fool. As I climbed into my dusty Ford pickup, I could see Arlen through the window, already on the phone, probably signing up another farmer for a 30-year mortgage on a piece of steel that would be obsolete in 10. Back at my farm, the silence of the machine shed was a welcome relief. The place was my sanctuary. It wasn't pretty. The floor was packed dirt, stained dark with a half-century of oil and grease. The walls were lined with old tools, some of them my grandfather's, their wooden handles worn smooth by generations of calloused hands. In the center bay, my John Deere 4020 sat waiting, its fenders scarred, its paint faded by 1,000 suns, but its lines still proud and strong. I didn't head for the tractor right away. First, I went to the old steel workbench, the surface littered with coffee cans full of bolts and nuts, sorted by size and thread. I cracked open a bottle of ice-cold Coca-Cola from the old chest freezer and just stood there, letting the quiet settle over me. Arlen's words echoed in my head. A ticking time bomb. Yesterday's man. Was he right? Was I just being stubborn, clinging to the past out of fear? I looked around my shop. Every tool, every machine was paid for. My 240 acres were free and clear. I had no payments, not for the land, not for the house, not for the equipment. In a good year, the money was all mine. In a bad year, I only had to worry about the property tax and feeding myself. For my neighbors, a bad year meant tense meetings with their loan officers. My gaze fell on the 4020. It wasn't just a machine, it was a partner. I knew its every quirk, every sound. I knew the specific way the starter whined on a cold morning, the gentle hiss of the hydraulics, the deep, throaty rumble of that 404 cubic inch diesel engine when it was pulling a 5-bottom plow through heavy clay. I'd done a complete in-frame overhaul on that engine myself 2 winters ago, replacing the sleeves, pistons and bearings. I knew its guts better than I knew my own. Putting the Coke bottle down, I grabbed a set of wrenches and a drain pan. The job wasn't complicated, but it was heavy and messy. I slid the wide pan under the tractor's belly and unscrewed the massive drain plug for the transmission and hydraulic reservoir. A thick, amber stream of high-guard fluid gushed out, smelling faintly of hot metal. It would take a good 20 minutes to drain all 12 gallons. While it drained, I got to work up top. I disconnected the hydraulic lines leading to the rock shaft housing, the heavy cast-iron assembly that held the 3-point hitch arms. I labeled each hose with a piece of masking tape and a grease pencil, so I wouldn't mix them up later. Then came the hard part. The housing itself was held on by a dozen heavy bolts. I put a long breaker bar on the first one and leaned into it with all my weight. It groaned in protest before finally breaking loose with a sharp crack that echoed in the shed. One by one they gave way. With the bolts out, the housing was free, but it weighed close to 200 pounds. This was a job for the engine hoist. I rolled the cherry picker over, hooked its chain to the heavy lifting eye on the housing, and slowly, carefully, cranked the handle. The housing lifted clear of the transmission case, revealing the intricate guts of the hydraulic system below. It was a beautiful, complex world of gears, valves, and pistons, all swimming in a film of amber oil. I lowered the housing onto a pair of wooden blocks on the floor. The problem was likely a blown O-ring in the main hydraulic pump, a common issue on these tractors if you pushed them too hard. It was a $5 rubber ring that was causing the leak and the loss of pressure. At the dealership, Arlen would have had a mechanic replace the entire pump for $500, plus labor. He'd call it preventative maintenance. I called it robbery. I spent the rest of the afternoon carefully disassembling the pump, cleaning each part in a pan of kerosene until it shone. I found the culprit, a small black O-ring, flattened and brittle with age and heat. It was split clean in two. I cleaned the groove it sat in, slipped a new, pliable ring into its place, and began the slow, methodical process of putting it all back together. It was greasy, knuckle-busting work. I dropped a wrench, swore, wiped the sweat from my brow with the back of a greasy hand, and kept going. This was the part Arlen and the new generation of farmers didn't understand. They saw a broken machine. I saw a puzzle to be solved. They saw a bill from the mechanic. I saw a Saturday afternoon spent with an old friend. They bought their solutions. I built mine. By the time the sun started to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the machine shed floor, the rock shaft housing was back in place, the bolts torqued down to spec. I refilled the reservoir with fresh high guard, pouring it slowly through a funnel with a fine mesh screen. After checking the level, I climbed up into the familiar, worn seat. I turned the key. The starter groaned for a second. Then the big diesel roared to life, filling the shed with its comforting, powerful rhythm. I moved the hitch lever. The big 3-point arms rose smoothly, powerfully, without a shudder or a leak. I smiled. It was a small victory, but it was mine. It hadn't cost me a trip to the bank. It hadn't put me further in debt. It had cost me an afternoon of my own labor and $4.65. That summer, the talk at the co-op was all about expansion. Corn hit $2.50 a bushel, then $3. Soybeans were right behind. The Russian grain deal was the talk of the nation. Earl Thompson, who farmed the section next to mine, came in one morning, grinning from ear to ear. He'd just leveraged his home place to buy the old Miller farm, another 300 acres. Arlen Vance set me up with a great deal, he boasted, leaning against a stack of feed sacks. variable rate tied to prime. With prices like these, I'll have it paid off in 10 years, maybe less. You ought to think about it, Jed. That 80 acres south of you is coming up for sale. I'm doing all right with what I've got, Earl, I said. He shook his head, just like Arlen had. You're not thinking big enough. Get big or get out. That's what they say. That fall, the harvest was a nightmare. It rained for 3 straight weeks in October. The ground turned to a thick, greasy gumbo. The big new combines, the ones with the 20-foot headers and grain tanks the size of a small truck, were sinking up to their axles. The Peterson boys got their brand new Assetrudersi 700 combine buried so deep they had to hire a crane to get it out. The bill, I heard, was over $1,000, not to mention the week of good weather they lost. My combine was an old International 715. It was smaller, lighter. I ran narrower tires and only took half a load in the grain tank, unloading more often. It was slow. It was tedious. But I kept moving. I finished my corn while my neighbors were still trying to figure out how to get their multi-ton behemoths unstuck. I took a ribbing for it at the diner. See Jed out there with his toy combine? They'd chuckle. Probably harvests 1 ear at a time. I let them laugh. I was putting dry corn in the bin while they were paying interest on machines sitting idle in a sea of mud. The next few years blurred into a cycle of hard work and quiet satisfaction. The commodity boom of the 70s was in full swing. Money was flowing like water in our little corner of the world. Arlen Vance's dealership grew. He built a new service center with 8 bays and hired 6 more mechanics. He started selling 4-wheel drive tractors, the massive Steigers and Versatiles that could pull a plow the size of a small house. The price tag on those was astronomical, but with land selling for $2,000 an acre and corn at $350, nobody seemed to care. The bank was always happy to lend more. Arlen himself became a local legend. He bought the old Miller farm from Earl Thompson when Earl overextended himself and had to sell out. Then he bought the section south of me. He wasn't just a dealer anymore. He was a landowner, a gentleman farmer who hired managers to run his operations while he flew to conventions in Las Vegas. He drove a new Lincoln Continental every year. His wife wore diamonds to church. At the annual Farmers' Appreciation Banquet, he was the keynote speaker. I was there that night, sitting at a back table in my best Sunday suit. Arlen stood at the podium, basking in the spotlight. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice booming through the microphone. "We are living in a golden age of agriculture. Never before have we had the technology, the opportunity, the financial instruments to achieve so much. We are the breadbasket of the world, and the key, my friends, the key to unlocking this potential is growth. It's about vision. It's about not being afraid to use the tools of modern finance to build a bigger, better, more profitable future." His eyes scanned the room, and, for a moment, they locked on mine. A small, smug smile played on his lips. "Now, there are still a few among us who cling to the old ways," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "who believe the best way to save money is to not spend it, who would rather patch a 30-year-old tractor than invest in a new one. To them I say this: you cannot save your way to prosperity. This is no time for timid souls. This is a time for lions, a time to be bold." The room erupted in applause. Men who were leveraged to their eyeballs, who owed the bank hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars, were on their feet, clapping and cheering. They were cheering for the man who held their notes, the man who was getting rich off their interest payments. I just sat there and slowly cut into my piece of roast beef. It tasted like ash. I didn't follow their path. The good years were good to me too. With no debt, the high prices meant pure profit. But I didn't spend it like they did. I didn't buy a new truck or a boat. I didn't take a vacation to Hawaii. I took that money and I reinvested it, quietly, in my own farm. I pattern-tiled the 80 acres of low ground, a massive, back-breaking job that cost a fortune in pipe but would pay dividends for the next 50 years in better yields. I replaced the roof on the barn and put up a new grain bin, a big 20,000-bushel sukup, and I paid for it with a check. The biggest purchase I made was in '77. My old International combine was getting tired, and parts were getting harder to find. I found a used John Deere 7700 Turbo, a good, solid machine from a retirement auction 2 counties over. It was clean, well-maintained, and had low hours. I paid $28,000 for it. Cash. The other farmers at the auction shook their heads. For just a little more, financed over 7 years, they could have gotten a brand new one. They saw me as a fool, a man who didn't understand the value of money. I saw myself as a free man. By 1979, the landscape of our county had been transformed. The fence rows were gone, bulldozed to make way for the giant machines. The small family farms were being swallowed up by the big operators, the lions Arlen had talked about. The whole system was running white-hot, fueled by cheap, easy credit and the belief that the good times would never end. But I could feel a change in the air. It was a subtle thing. A news report on the radio about inflation getting out of control, the price of fuel creeping up, then jumping, the cost of fertilizer and seed making a leap that took your breath away. In the back of the Farm Journal, there were small articles about something called the Federal Reserve, and a new chairman, a man named Paul Volcker, who was talking about wringing inflation out of the economy. The articles mentioned interest rates. Prime rate, they called it. It was at 12%, then 15%. One evening in the late fall of 1979, I was sitting in my worn armchair, going over my books. The harvest was done, the crops were sold, and the numbers were good. The farm had cleared a tidy profit. In my savings account at the bank, I had a comfortable cushion, enough to see me through a bad year or two. My checkbook was balanced. My only bills were for the electricity and the telephone. I looked out the window, across my fields, dark and resting under a blanket of stars. A deep sense of peace settled over me. Then I turned on the old black-and-white television in the corner to catch the late news. The anchorman's face was grim. He was talking about the economy, about the crisis in Iran. And then he said a sentence that sent a chill down my spine. In Washington today, the Federal Reserve, in a dramatic move to combat runaway inflation, raised the prime interest rate to an unprecedented 20%. Financial experts are warning of a severe economic downturn. 20%. The number hung in the air, seeming to suck all the warmth out of the room. I thought of Earl Thompson, of the Peterson boys, of all the others. I thought of their variable rate loans. I looked out my window again, past my dark fields, toward the horizon. 5 miles away, a brilliant beacon of light cut through the blackness. It was the glow from the massive floodlights over Arlen Vance's John Deere dealership, a shining temple of debt burning brightly all through the night. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that a storm was coming. A storm of a different kind, one that no amount of horsepower could pull you out of. The first few months of 1980 felt like the world was holding its breath. That news report about the 20% prime rate wasn't just a number. It was a tremor, a deep shudder that ran through the heartland. At the diner, the talk of buying more land and new equipment vanished overnight. It was replaced by hushed, anxious whispers about operating loans and input costs. The price of diesel fuel seemed to jump every time I filled the barrels by the shed. A bag of Pioneer seed corn that cost $40 last year was suddenly $65. Everything was going up except the price we were getting for our grain. Then came the grain embargo against the Soviets, and the bottom fell out of the market. A bushel of corn, which had been flirting with $4, plummeted to $2.25. The change in Arlen Vance was subtle at first. The easy, confident smile was still there, but it didn't quite reach his eyes anymore. His ads in the local paper grew larger, more desperate, screaming about inflation-beating deals and creative financing. He started stocking smaller equipment, hoping to appeal to the few hobby farmers who weren't leveraged to the hilt. But the big iron, the massive four-wheel drive tractors, and the 6-row combines sat on his lot under the bright lights, gathering dust and interest. Each one was a monument to a future that had been cancelled. Then, that spring, the sky turned against us. It simply stopped raining. April was dry. May was a dust bowl. The young corn plants, which should have been knee-high by Memorial Day, were stunted, pathetic little shoots, their leaves a pale, sickly yellow-green. By June, the ground was cracked and hard as pavement. The sun beat down with a relentless, brassy glare. You could stand in the fields and watch the heat shimmer off the baked earth, and you could feel the moisture being sucked out of the very air you breathed. The new, modern machines began to show their weaknesses. Bill Jensen's big International 1466, the one with the screaming turbo, developed a problem with its electronic fuel injection system. It was a complex, finicky piece of technology that no one in the county really understood. Bill spent 3 days on the phone with a specialist in Moline while his tractor sat idle. Arlen's mechanics were swamped with similar issues on the new Deeres, the complex hydraulic systems, the sensitive electronic controls. They were brilliant when they worked, but when they failed in the dust and the extreme heat, they became expensive, immobile sculptures. The parts had to be ordered, shipped from a regional warehouse, and cost a small fortune. One sweltering afternoon in July, I was cultivating my soybeans, trying to conserve what little moisture was left in the soil. My 4020 was chugging along steadily, the old diesel engine humming its familiar, reassuring tune. I was running a 6-row cultivator, a simple, tough piece of steel I'd rebuilt myself. As I came to the end of a row, I saw a cloud of dust on the road. It was Earl Thompson's pickup, and he was driving way too fast. He skidded to a stop by my fence row and got out, his face pale under his tan. "Jed, you gotta help me," he said, his voice cracking. "It's my Steiger, the big one, the transmission. It just quit. Won't go into gear. It's sitting in the middle of the south section, and I've got the planter hooked to it." His Steiger was one of the articulated 4-wheel drive giants, a green monster he'd bought from Arlen 2 years prior. He'd paid over $100,000 for it. He was trying to plant a second crop of beans, a desperate gamble to make up for the failed corn. "Did you call Arlen's shop?" I asked, throttling the 4020 down to an idle. "They're 2 weeks out," Earl said, wiping a sleeve across his sweaty forehead. 2 weeks. By then it'll be too late to plant anything. The bank is already breathing down my neck, Jed. I need a crop. Any crop." I looked at his face, the face of a man standing on a trap door, and I nodded. "Unhook your planter. I'll pull your tractor out of the field for you. Then maybe we can take a look at it in your shop." My 4020 was dwarfed by the massive Steiger. It was like tying a pony to a freight train, but I put the old deer in its lowest gear, eased out the clutch, and slowly, steadily, the big diesel dug in. The rear tires bit into the hard-baked soil, and with a groan of protesting steel, The Steiger began to move. It took me an hour to drag it the half-mile to his machine shed. The problem, it turned out, was a single broken solenoid in the electronic shift controller. A $50 part, buried deep in a maze of wires and hydraulic lines. It took us the rest of the day and half the night to get to it, using my old electrical tester and a dog-eared service manual. While we worked, Earl talked. He told me his variable rate loan had adjusted to 21%. His payments had more than doubled. He hadn't been paying the principal for 6 months, just the interest, and he was still falling behind. Arlen told me land would hit 4,000 an acre by 1985, he said, his voice hollow as he stared into the guts of his tractor. He said corn would be $5. We all believed him. We wanted to believe him. We finally got the new solenoid installed. The tractor started and went into gear. Earl's relief was so profound, it was painful to watch. He offered me money, but I refused. "Just help the next man who needs it, Earl," I told him. He nodded, his eyes filled with a gratitude that was deeper than words. Driving home in the pre-dawn light, I passed Arlen's dealership. A single light was on in the office. I could see his silhouette through the window, hunched over his desk, a lonely figure in his temple of broken dreams. The cracks in his empire were beginning to show. The drought broke in late August with a series of violent thunderstorms that flattened what was left of the corn and washed away the topsoil. The harvest of 1980 was a catastrophe. Yields were less than half of what was normal. For men like Earl, who needed a bumper crop just to pay the interest on their loans, it was a death sentence. The auction notices started appearing in the paper that fall. First, it was just a few small operators. Then, bigger names began to appear. The Peterson boys, with their fleet of new green paint, had a dispersal sale in October. I went, not to buy, but to watch. The mood was somber, funereal. Men stood in silence, their hands in their pockets, watching a lifetime of work go under the auctioneer's hammer for pennies on the dollar. The bankers were there, of course, standing in a tight, grim-faced group, taking notes on clipboards. Arlen Vance was there too. He was trying to bid on some of his own equipment, trying to prop up the prices, but he didn't have the cash. I watched him get outbid on a 40 tractor he had sold to the Petersons just 3 years earlier. The shame on his face was a terrible thing to see. By the spring of '81, the crisis was in full swing. It was all anyone talked about. Foreclosure. Bankruptcy. Chapter 11. They were ugly, foreign words that had suddenly become part of our daily vocabulary. The bank in town, the same one that had been so eager to lend money 5 years ago, was now cold and unforgiving. They called in notes, refused to extend operating loans, and foreclosed without mercy. It was a brutal, systematic culling. My farm was an island in a sea of chaos. I had no debt. My grain bin was still half full of last year's corn, which I had held back, waiting for the price to recover even a little. My property taxes were paid. My needs were simple. I watched my neighbors lose everything, and a profound survivor's guilt settled over me. These were good men, hard-working men. Their only crime was that they had believed the gospel of endless growth preached by men like Arlen Vance. Arlen's downfall was swift and total. His dealership, starved of customers and choked by the interest on its massive inventory, went into receivership. The bank padlocked the doors in the summer of '82. The shiny new tractors were hauled away on flatbed trucks, repossessed by John Deere. His own farmland, the properties he had bought up with such pride, went on the auction block one by one. The 80 acres south of my place was the last to go. I went to the auction, held on the courthouse steps. It was a grey, drizzly November day. A small crowd had gathered, mostly other farmers and a few bankers. Arlen was there, standing off to the side with his wife. He looked 10 years older. The tailored suit was gone, replaced by a worn work coat. The confident swagger was replaced by a weary slump in his shoulders. He looked like a ghost, haunting his own execution. The auctioneer started the bidding. It was slow. No one had any money. The bankers weren't interested. They already owned too much land they couldn't sell. The bidding stalled at $400 an acre, a quarter of what it had been worth just a few years before. The auctioneer called for bids, his voice echoing in the damp air. 400 once, 400 twice. I looked at Arlen. His eyes met mine across the small crowd. There was no arrogance left in them, only a deep, hollow despair. In that moment, I didn't see the man who had mocked me, who had called me a peasant. I saw a neighbor who was losing his world. My father's words echoed in my mind. Never kick a man when he's down, son. You never know when you'll be the one on the ground. I raised my hand. 450, I said, my voice clear and steady. A murmur went through the crowd. All eyes turned to me. The banker who held the note on the property, a man named Henderson, looked surprised. He knew I didn't carry debt. He didn't think I had the cash. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. I have 450. Do I hear 500? Silence. 450 going once. Twice. Sold to Jedediah Smith for $450 an acre. I walked to the clerk's table and wrote out a check from my savings account. It took a large chunk of my cushion, but I knew the land. It was good. Black dirt. As I folded the receipt and put it in my pocket, Arlen approached me, his wife a step behind him. Jedediah, he said, his voice thick with emotion. He couldn't seem to find the words. It's good land, Arlen, I said quietly. It deserves to be farmed. I don't know what to say, he stammered. After everything I said to you in that showroom. That was a long time ago, I said. Different world. I paused, then made a decision. Listen, I'm going to need help on that 80, and my fences need mending. It's not much, but if you're looking for work, the job pays $5 an hour. Cash. Tears welled up in his eyes. He nodded, unable to speak. His wife put a hand on his arm, her own eyes shining with gratitude. It wasn't charity, it was a job. It was a chance to work the same land he had once owned, to keep his hands in the soil. It was a sliver of dignity. And right then, that was worth more than all the money in the world. The next few years were about rebuilding, not just for Arlen, but for the whole community. The flashy, high-stakes game of farming was over. In its place was a return to the old ways, thrift, hard work, and diversification. Men started bringing their old equipment to my shop. They'd heard I could fix just about anything. I spent my winters helping them overhaul engines, rebuild transmissions, and fabricate parts for machines that hadn't been made in 30 years. I didn't charge them much, just enough to cover my costs. It was my way of helping the community heal. The men who had once called me a fool now called me for advice. They saw that my 40-20, still running strong after all those years, wasn't a symbol of backwardness, but of resilience. They saw that my paid-for grain bin wasn't an unnecessary expense, but a tool of independence. They finally understood what my father had taught me. The bank can be a useful tool, but it should never be your master. The land is your partner, not a commodity to be leveraged, and the only true wealth is to owe no man anything. Arlen worked for me for 5 years. He was a good hand, a hard worker. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet humility. We never spoke of the boom years or his time as a dealer. We talked about the weather, crop prices, and the best way to fix a leaking hydraulic cylinder. We became friends, a friendship forged in the shared language of the soil. He eventually saved enough to buy a small house in town, and he took a job managing the local co-op. He was good at it. He understood the numbers, but now he also understood the people behind them. He made sure the co-op never pushed a farmer into a deal he couldn't afford. I never got married, never had children of my own. The farm was my wife and my legacy. But in the late 80s, my sister's boy, young Michael, started spending his summers with me. He was a city kid, but he had the farmer's gene in him. He loved the smell of diesel and the feel of the earth in his hands. He was fascinated by the old machinery. One Saturday afternoon, we were in the machine shed, leaning against the fender of the 40-20. It was showing its age now. Its green paint almost completely faded away in places, revealing the primer underneath. But the engine started on the first turn, every time. Michael was 16, and his head was full of the future. "Uncle Jed," he said, running a hand over the tractor's scarred fender. "Why didn't you ever buy a new tractor? One with a cab and air conditioning and a radio?" I looked at the old dare, my partner for so many years. I thought of Arlen's showroom, the smell of new paint, the promise of an easy future. I thought of the auction on the courthouse steps, the desperation in the eyes of my neighbors, the quiet hum of my own solvency in a world gone mad. I picked up a greasy wrench from the workbench, its steel worn smooth and dark with age, and placed it in his young hand. It had belonged to his great-grandfather. "Michael," I began, my voice quiet but sure. "This farm, this land, this tractor, they're all connected. They're not about getting rich quick. They're about something else. They're about freedom. Every time you can fix something yourself instead of paying someone else to do it, you're buying a little piece of freedom. Every time you save your money and pay cash instead of borrowing, you're buying a bigger piece. And when you own everything you have, free and clear, when you don't owe the bank or the dealer or anyone else a single dime, you're the richest man in the county because you're free." He looked from the wrench to the old tractor, and then to me, and I saw in his eyes that he was beginning to understand. He was seeing beyond the faded paint and the dented metal to the heart of the machine, and to the heart of the man who kept it running. The lesson was being passed on. The legacy would endure. The land would remember.